Hello, good morning and welcome. Like you mentioned, my name is Odaelys Pollard. Just a disclaimer, this is the first time I'm wearing heels since 2020. So if I fall, it's not because I passed out, it's because I cannot walk in them. And so today I'll be talking to you about the illusion of accessibility in STEM, COVID-19 edition. We know the pandemic has uprooted many things, and I'm going to specifically highlight what is done in the field of science education and outreach, focusing on underrepresented groups. Now, usually before I do these talks, I want to come to you telling you a little bit of where I'm coming from, my perspective, my story. These are lived experiences. My experiences, unfortunately, are not unique, and I've interacted with many students that look like myself who are interested in STEM, who wants the ability to get access to STEM. So I was actually born and raised in the United States Virgin Islands, and if you all cannot see, if we look right here in this little region, that's where we lie. We're about southeast of Puerto Rico. For those who still can't see, I zoomed it in for you. I'm actually from the big island of St. Croix, Big Island. We have a population of about 60,000 people. We're one of technically 4 islands in the U.S. Virgin Islands. We're U.S. citizens, but we live in the Caribbean, so the best of both worlds. My parents are actually from St. Kitts and Nevis, migrated up in the 70s for a better life for themselves and for their children. And if you haven't yet, this is a reminder to go visit. And so this year, it's actually their 70th Carnival Festival. So if you want to go out and have drinks and party and have fun, this is the place to be. No, I was not given money by the USVI Festival Committee. I'm just saying it's a great opportunity to see what's out there. And so growing up, I actually had a really neat knack of science and math. I was a smart kid. I remember trying to get all A's. My parents were also telling me, like, if you don't get all A's, don't come home, but that's beside the point. But it was in middle school when I realized that, hey, I actually enjoy thinking about problems, figuring out solutions. It was my first time being involved in a science fair. And in the science fair, I remember reading through the encyclopedia and being super excited and asking all these questions. I'm also from a religious household. That didn't really go well with my parents, telling me what to do. I'm like, but why, Mom? Why, Dad? And because I said so, it just didn't sit well with me. But my parents, being from the islands, was like, okay, you're smart in math and science. You're going to be the medical doctor. That's all we know, right? If you like math and science, medical doctor. All right, cool. Let's do that. So I went on to the University of the Virgin Islands, the Caribbean-only HBCU, so historically black college and universities. I got a scholarship, full scholarship, another reason why I stayed at the University of the Virgin Islands. Went on to major in biology, Bachelor's of Science in Biology. And really enjoyed it, had my mind set to be a medical doctor. Then I volunteered in a hospital, had my mind set on not being a medical doctor. And so I went into panic mode. I went to one of my mentors, and I was like, hey, I really enjoy doing science. I really enjoy doing math. What can I do with this degree to leave the islands, to further my education, and to do something that I enjoy and love? So she mentioned doing a post-baccalaureate research program. And this was the opportunity to do hands-on research and take graduate school courses at an institution that had available science research. So I migrated from the U.S. Virgin Islands to Rochester, New York. And so, I don't know how many of y'all have been to Rochester, New York. Not many people look like myself, all right? And so, all right, it was a great institution. I enjoyed the activities there. I enjoyed the research there. But it was the first time that I was now coming from a place where I was one of many to now being the one and only, right? So suffering with imposter syndrome, trying to figure out, do I belong in this space? Trying to decide, is this actually the field that I want to go into? It's something that I love doing, but I don't feel like I'm included. There were times I'll be mistaken for a custodial worker instead of a scientist. Right? And so these things I had to grapple with to try to decide, hey, do I want to stay or do I want to leave? Thankfully, I have had really great mentors, really supportive friends who all were experiencing things similar, so we were kind of confiding in all of our struggles, but we all made it. I decided to go on to pursue my PhD in microbiology and immunology. This is myself and the incoming class that year. And there I really had the opportunity to kind of spread my wings and figure out what I wanted to do in this space, what I wanted to do with this PhD degree when I'm finished. One thing that I realized when I was there, that students who had access to work in the laboratories didn't look like myself, right? They had connections. Their mom or dad worked at the hospital nearby. The PI had relationships with their parents. And I tutored a number of underrepresented minoritized groups who were really intelligent, really wanted to get the opportunity, but didn't know how to get that. So my colleague and I started a research program for those students, connected them with research at the university, and supported them through that process. A number of these students have gone on to also become STEM professionals. I graduated, thankfully, with my PhD in microbiology. Here I am, the first to graduate college in my family, the first to get a postgraduate degree in my family. Thank you. Major accomplishments, this is my mom and dad. My dad unfortunately passed in 2019, but he was there supporting me through the years. My mom is still around, my sister. Some of my biggest supporters are in this picture. So now I've gone through all these hurdles, finally got the PhD. Now I'm entering into the workforce. And so here I am with a couple of my former colleagues. I'm working at Rockefeller University, part of the outreach program at the commencement ceremony. And in this position, I was able to interact with thousands of young people throughout New York City public schools. They'll come into our labs, have these one-off research experiences, get them engaged, doing some really exciting hands-on work, figuring out how does science connect with your everyday life. Things like connecting food and science, connecting your DNA information, and how that impacts you in science. But I really wanted to have a larger impact and figuring that I can do that at an institution where the majority were underrepresented. So then I moved on to becoming the director of research at Borough of Manhattan Community College, one of the largest community colleges in New York City. And here I have the opportunity to engage with young people who really want the opportunity to have a more authentic and engaging experience in STEM. But not only am I a STEM professional, I am a wife and a mother. This is why Baby Shark is the song that I know all the words to. My supportive husband, Tavon, my sister, here's my son, he's 3. My daughter just turned 1. That was at her birthday party last weekend. It's funny because I spoke to them this morning and my son, Tyson, Mom, where are you? Are you working? Mommy, are you at work? Yes, baby, I'm at work. I'll be home soon. Unfortunately, he doesn't know that I'm enjoying the experience of not having to wake up at 7 o'clock in the morning with 2 kids tugging at my feet. Through this journey, there have been many hurdles. Like I mentioned, this is not unique. Being a mom, being a STEM professional, being of the minoritized communities, being in a space where you're not fully represented, being in a space where you cannot entirely be your whole self because you feel like you don't belong. So I want to talk about some of the ways that we can access STEM, right? And some of the hiccups that come into play for when we want to access STEM. So I think the first is our foundation at home. Right, thinking about, do you have parents who've gone on to get a college degree? Do they know what it's like to be in the field of science? Who can support you through that role? A lot of times their family members don't really understand what it means to be in STEM. Doesn't understand, my parents still, only since COVID-19 pandemic does my mom understand that I'm a PhD scientist and not a medical doctor. Let's just put it that way. So now she tells her friends, like, I could call my daughter, she's a scientist, she can explain the vaccine. I'm telling you, you won't mutate, right? It's fine. Which, we know that's ongoing conspiracy theory. The next is foundation in education. And so being in New York City, I've been in the area for about 15 years now, we realize that there are resources that aren't available to every school, right? And when we think about having the opportunity for students to engage in really authentic, really rigorous work is not really there throughout all of the public schools in New York City or rural schools in certain areas. And so that impacts your access to STEM. Retainment and inclusivity. Once you've passed these stages, you've gone on to college, postgraduate education, in the workforce, do you feel like you belong? Are there microaggressions in your workspace, in your school space? Do you feel like, you're code switching is a term that we use where you kind of at the door put back your whole self and turn into someone else who you think they want to interact with in that space? Next is culture, religion, and economic status. So we know a lot of folks have specific cultures and religions and feel that it doesn't coincide with being a scientist. I've had students come to me and say, hey, I'm a Christian, and I just don't think my parents don't agree that I should go into science, and there's this notation that the two can't coincide. So really trying to think about who this person is, right, and what space they're coming from, what their culture is, and building a space where they too can experience the joys of science. And we also know that economic status plays a role. There are studies that show if your parents have a postgraduate degrees, those children are the ones who go on to become PIs at research institutions. And finally, the awareness and availability of opportunities. I like to say it's not that students aren't interested, they aren't given the opportunities to become interested. There are many times I've interacted with students that they've never held a pipette, right? It's the coolest thing they've ever seen in their life, right? And just one simple experiment, one simple conversation with these students can really spark the flame to get them into STEM. So I'm going to zone into New York City and talk about STEM access in New York City public schools. Like I mentioned, I've interacted with thousands of students, one-off. We have a research program where I've interacted with a number of underrepresented minoritized youths, but also I've interacted with students who are high achieving. They have like Cell Nature articles in the 11th grade. But the access is definitely different in the schools that they attend. So New York City, if you don't know, it's the largest school district in the United States, have over 1 million students. And the demographics of the school, we have about 70% that are considered underrepresented in STEM, Black and Hispanic. But more so, there are also about 72% that are economically disadvantaged. And so what you're expecting to see is that the schools actually showcase this racial representative of the city. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So studies are showing that actually 30% of New York City public schools actually have the racial representation of the city. The others do not. The Department of Education knows that this is an issue, and they've been working towards figuring it out. Now, in New York City, the school system is a little different when it comes to going into high school. So now, living in the suburbs, it's like whatever school is in your neighborhood, that's the school you go to. In New York City, when you're in middle school, you apply to go to different high schools, and there are actually specific high schools they call specialized high schools, where you take an additional standardized exam to get into those specialized high schools. Now, there are 3 specialized high schools that are really great in STEM. It's Stuyvesant High School, Bronx High School of Science, and Brooklyn Tech High School. And so this is data from 2019, those big articles in the New York Times showcasing that, hey, these students who want like really great access to STEM aren't getting that because only 7 out of about 900 students in Stuyvesant were Black. Only 12 out of about 800 students in Bronx High School of Science are Black. And only about 95 out of almost 2,000 students in Brooklyn Tech High School were Black. Right? And so they've tried to figure out ways to try to even out this racial representation and ensure that students who really have the skill set and the intelligence to go into STEM to do so. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. So this is new data, 2022-2023, showcasing that some of the groups that are represented in STEM, like the Asian groups, we have 31% of the test takers were Asian, but 52% were given admissions into these specialized high schools. When we look at some of the other groups, Black and Hispanics, we show that about 20-25% of them test takers, but only 3 to 5% were given admissions to these schools. So we can see right away that these students aren't getting into the schools that have the really nice laboratories, the really great access. These are schools that recruiters come into, handpick these students to go on to these really great research institutions moving forward. And the COVID pandemic has actually impacted the schooling of not just students in specialized high school, but New York City public schools overall. When the pandemic started, over 100,000 households lacked internet. And it makes me realize how privileged we are. Everyone sitting in here, I'm sure you have a smartphone on you, right? If it's connected to the internet, you are of a group that are very privileged, right? And even though New York City did provide hotspots and provided devices, a lot of times these students lacked the proper workspace to do the work required for their high school. And even college. And so I don't know how many of y'all been to New York City. Have you ever seen like a standard 1-bedroom apartment? The average, 500 square feet? And there are families that live in these 1-bedroom apartments. Imagine trying to do remote learning in a space where you're living with your brothers, your sisters, your mom, and your dad, trying to do your work in your bedroom. Not conducive to learning. And we also have the onset of inexperienced teachers. And not that the teachers weren't great. It's that we went from in-person to remote in like 2 days, right? I remember also teaching my students in the research group and having to completely revamped the curriculum, from having this really nice hands-on curriculum to being like, okay, how the heck am I going to engage these students over Zoom? Everyone was learning Zoom for the first time. Everyone was figuring out all these tools in order to continuously engage these students in STEM. And so it really impacted these teachers trying to figure out tools to use, the teachers trying to figure out Zoom, Google Meet, the requirements for different institutions and schools around. Also, one of the things that impacted our community is food insecurities. Luckily, New York City did provide food for students. They also provided EBT or food stamps for all public school students. But we know that when you're thinking about where your next paycheck is going to come from, where your next meal is going to come from, you're not fully engaged in your schoolwork. And so all of these has impacted in what we're calling now learning loss or missed learning opportunities. So imagine we have these students that have been doing remote learning in their homes for 2 years. They're going back now in person. They're realizing like, whoa, I didn't learn anything in the past 2 years. How am I going to catch up? How am I going to relearn all of the things that I now don't understand clearly? But say we pass through the high school stage, we're now going into college, you have your head set that, hey, I'm gonna now major in a science or engineering field or STEM field. What does that look like for these groups? And so these are demographics from 1995 to 2012, and pretty steady from 2012 to now, showing the amount of students enrolled in college, first-time students at four-year institutions, who actually say, hey, I'm gonna major in a science or STEM field. And so we see about 41% are Hispanic, so overrepresentation of what they represent in the US, and about 36% go into college wanting to major in STEM. Unfortunately, this does not follow through for those who are actually getting the degrees in STEM. And so this is updated data, I believe this is from 2019, where we showcase the students that are actually getting degrees in STEM, Bachelor of Science about 16%, the representation of the groups that they study is about 21%, so underrepresented amount. And also, we look at Black students who are pursuing their bachelor's in STEM. Only about 8% go on to get their degrees, right, in comparison to 14% of that population. So this is showing that more than half of these underrepresented minorities group go in thinking that, hey, I want to do science, hey, I want to major in STEM, but don't end up actually getting the degrees in STEM. And there are many things that can impact this, right? There are many factors to that. Like I mentioned, there are foundations at home. Navigating college for the first time is rough, right? If you don't have someone to support you, if you don't have someone to say, hey, this is how you set your schedule, this is how you set up time to study, make sure you find certain friends that are good in certain areas, it's really hard to continue. I know who all have taken like organic chemistry in college. We call that the weed out course, right? And so a lot of these students go into the course, the first test get a 30, and was like, oh, nah, if this is like what I have to go through my freshman or sophomore year, ain't no way I'm getting a degree in STEM, right? And then transition into something else. And so how can we figure out how to ensure that these students are fully supported, they get the tools they need to actually get a degree in STEM? Now, when we look at the COVID pandemic and how that's impacted enrollment, there's been a new study showing now that enrollment has drastically decreased among all sectors. So we see a decrease of -3% and 4% in 2021 and 2022. And this is also the case when we look at public 2- and 4-year institutions. And we know that in these public institutions, we have a large number of underrepresented minoritized group attending those schools. And so the largest increase that we know has been in these underrepresented groups. I think they say that community colleges have seen the largest decrease in enrollment, about like -30% in some community colleges, right? And thinking about like what these students are now thinking about when they're thinking about school, right? The pandemic, we know inflation, right? We know job loss, trying to find ways to make ends meet. We're trying to figure out, hey, is schooling actually worth it? Do I want to go into an institution where I have to take out school loans, repay that? Is it going to be a good investment, return on investment, if I go on to schools? But on the upside, we've seen that when we talk about retainment and inclusivity, there are an increase of applicants to HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities, minority-serving institutions, or Hispanic-serving institutions. Also showcasing that students are now, I think, During the pandemic, we've had the George Floyd. There's been this, uprising of, hey, we belong in this space. We want to do things, right? And they wanted to go into space where they feel included and they feel that they're represented. And so we're now seeing this uptick in applications to these schools. Now, let's say you've gone through all of these. The data is very similar in when we look at postgraduate education, like masters and PhDs. But let's say now you're a STEM professional. I've made it. I'm going to go on and work in the STEM arena. And so what we're seeing now is actually that Blacks and Hispanics are still underrepresented in all STEM jobs. So when we look at all jobs, about 11%, STEM jobs, 9% in Blacks. Most of Blacks and minoritized groups usually go into nursing, CNAs, LPNs. When we look at the hard science, life sciences, we definitely see a smaller percentage of folks in those fields. And there are studies now that show that engineering is actually dropping in terms of Blacks and Hispanics going into those fields, not just for college, but in the STEM workforce. Very similarly for Hispanics, 17% in all jobs, but only 8% in the fields of STEM. And this is a drastic difference when we look at some of the overrepresentation groups like Asians. They represent 6% of all jobs, but are 13% in STEM arenas. And even when we look at this, we see that women in STEM still make less than their male counterparts, right? There are lots of studies showing the disparities in income, in job offers when it comes to women versus men in their workforce. Not only that, but we see that the pay gap still exists when we look at minoritized groups to their white counterparts, showcasing that there is still disparities in terms of what we're being offered or what we're seeing as we're valued. Some can argue that some groups don't advocate for themselves, right? I talked about imposter syndrome. Sometimes you get that job offer and you're like, all right, cool, you're gonna give me $40,000. That's more than my entire family makes, right? I'll take it. And they don't really, go in and fight for a higher salary. And so these are all these things that we're trying to showcase to our students that, hey, when you get that job offer, this is what you fight for. You are worth it. You belong in this space. You fight for what you want. But how has the COVID pandemic impacted STEM professionals and in the workforce? Luckily, STEM jobs have actually fared pretty well, right? With the vaccine development, a lot of people are now saying that science is the field to go into. Unfortunately, it has also declined, and we saw that these underrepresented groups are, a small number of those in those STEM jobs. Women, specifically mothers, have really, really struggled through the pandemic. I can't tell you, when the pandemic hit, it was March 2020, I remember it vividly. My son was 6 months old, and they shut down all the labs at Rockefeller University. They shut down the daycare. They said everyone has to go home, and I literally was like, oh my God, this is how the world ends. Like, I don't know what I'm gonna do. But can you imagine working at home with a 6-month-old? And trying to keep sane? It was difficult. That's when I actually seeked out therapy, which was a good thing. but it was very, very difficult. And so, a lot of women in STEM workforce actually, need affordable childcare. Even when things opened up again, for example, our daycare opened at 9:30, you could drop them off, but you have to pick them up at 4. What am I gonna do in like 6 hours, right? When you think about commuting to the space, dropping your child off at the door, making sure you're there exactly at 4 o'clock to pick them up, taking them home, finishing up the work that you have to do with a screaming toddler or a child in the background, it can be very difficult for mothers in the space. So they've actually seen the largest increase in folks that leave the workforce have been women, unfortunately. We have seen that white workers and white men have been the least affected by the pandemic, right? I think just thinking about responsibilities and support that they have, many people have, different reasons for continuing to work, and they're, in these fields where they can work remotely. There are a lot of studies showing that a lot of underrepresented groups had face-facing jobs, right? So they have to be in person. If things shut down, they can't do their work remote, right? So a lot of them experience job loss. So moving forward, how can we make STEM more accessible, more inclusive, and more diverse? And so here I am with a couple of my past students. I remember I went to this Black in STEM symposium, and I was speaking to these 2 young girls, and they were like, oh my God, "You are the first Black woman scientist I've ever seen in my life." And they were like hyperventilating. And I was like, "It's okay, it's cool, like you can do it too, like let me give you my email address." And it was just even the little things like, "Oh, how did you do your hair?" And like, "Oh, I did this in this place." And "Oh, it took so long to do." Girl, yeah, I know. Like it's just like interacting and having those conversations to make them feel like, hey, I don't have to leave my full self behind and I can come into this space wholeheartedly. And here I am with some of my other students, our Jumpstart students, doing their work in STEM. This was pre-pandemic. And just being that person to, impact how they see science and ensure, well, I know there's still like hiccups in the field, but giving them the tools needed to navigate that space. And so I've been involved in many organizations working to engage students in STEM. At my work at BMCC, allowing for students to take part in research activities. We have our STEP program, which is a science technology entry program, which is a New York State funded program, where we recruit high school students from across New York City to take courses in math, chemistry, robotics, and engage them with authentic hands-on activities. We also have the New York STEM Education Network, which is a large network in New York City that offers these after-school STEM engagement activities. There are a lot of new initiatives now nationwide because they see that it has been a problem with folks in underrepresented groups feeling that they belong in that space. So they've initiated trainings, cultural competency trainings, bias trainings, thinking about who's hiring for these folks, making sure that you can put your implicit biases behind. There's a talk, there's data showing that you argue for the person that reminds you of yourself, right? So if they're white men reviewing applications or student applications, like, oh, this kid reminds me of myself, they get an entry, right? So just thinking about how these things can impact how you move forward in your workspace. And I think as a whole, just thinking about how have your identities shaped your experiences? I talk a lot about your positionality in STEM. You're in STEM. What brings you into this space? We say that science is for the benefit of humanity, but if there are only one specific group in STEM, then are we really doing it for humanity? Humanity encompasses all of us, different cultures, different backgrounds, different situations. We have not walked a step in someone else's life. We don't understand why they decide to do certain things or why they believe the things they believe, but we should always think about how they are coming into the space and how we can support them. And also, how can you make your space inclusive? Where do you work at? Are you at an institution? Are you at a company? Who is there that doesn't look like you? How can you understand the experiences that they're bringing into the workspace? How are they making it more unique and a beautiful arena for progressing STEM? And just thinking about, hey, we bringing in folks that looks not like us and folks that look like us and coming together to make that space feel more inclusive. Reducing the microaggressions and the things that may not be so okay and just having a second thought about who we're interacting with in our space. And if we make these spaces more inclusive, you'll then see the uptick in diversity. A lot of folks talk about like, hey, let's just bring in folks from diverse backgrounds, but we don't make that space inclusive for them. So I think if we work on inclusivity, we can then work on making our spaces more diverse. Thank you.